All right, one of the big advantages of digitally compositing over traditional collage is not just that we can stretch the pixels and flip them, and you can't do that with a magazine cutout. Maybe the biggest advantage is we can change the lighting and the color of the image. So this is a new skill that we didn't do in exercise 1, except to clean up the black and white pixels to make clean black line art, right? But here we can change a purple sky into a pink sky into a blue sky, from a bright sky to a dark sky, right? And we can do that for every layer. So I'm going to take my furthest background layer, and I'm going to ask you, wherever you are in the project, to save your work and choose your furthest background composited layer that's on top of your sketch. So mine is this sky. And once that layer is selected, we are going to learn the 3 direct adjustments. And that's something that will be on some of our tests, right? Like midterm and final exams. There's only 3 I need you to know. What a direct adjustment is that you are using settings to directly change the pixels in a selection or a layer. You are not indirectly changing them. You are directly changing them. The pixel changes. It changes color. It changes value. And those tools are found under image, just like image size, just like canvas size, but it's higher up. It's image adjustments. So these are the direct image adjustments. I'm going to show you what they are not, because this can really confuse you. They are not under layer, and they are not layer adjustments, even though they're the exact same list of things. Because a layer adjustment is indirect and will affect every layer underneath it. A direct adjustment will only affect the pixels in the selection or the layer. And that's why we learn them that way, so you understand what's happening. A lot of digital editing is understanding what you're actually affecting. Not just what looks cool at the end, but how you got there. So there are 3 adjustments we're going to use. Does anyone remember the one we used for exercise 1 to clean up black line art? Say it nice and loud. Just make guesses. Levels. Yes. So this top group of 4, this is all about lights and darks, right? And you can't get more light and dark than black and white line art, right? So levels is the one from this family I want us to always use first. It gives us the histogram. You'll remember that our black and white line art histogram was just like 2 bookends at the side of an empty chasm. But a histogram of most images is in the midtones. So this sky is all blues and pinks. All of those are in the midtones. It only has a few darker tones, which might even be hidden. And what I want to do first when I'm playing with levels on a composite layer is I want to play with the midtone slider, this gray triangle. And in Photopea, it's a square, but it's the same tool. If I push it towards the white, like to the right, then it makes that midtone just darker overall. A deeper, darker sky. And if I push it to the left towards the black side, it's actually going to get brighter. And if I think about the image I want, it starts with that background sky. What is that lighting condition? Do I want this to be a pretty bright image? Or do I want it to be a pretty dark, moody image? Does that make sense? And that's all with levels. This is not color control yet. This is just lights and darks. And it's generally not a good idea to go very far. Like if I go too far, it goes to pure white. If I go too far, it goes to pure black. I would say you want to go about 20% in either direction at the most, right? And if you wanted it to push further, then maybe you need another reference image that's darker or lighter. So I'm going to push it about 20% towards the light because I think that looks good. Now, every time you do a direct image adjustment, in this case levels, you can always just look at your history, or you can hit Command Z, and you can see what it looked like before you did that. And you can make sure that you liked what you did, right? I like what I did. If I don't want to see my guide layer, I can just hit Command semicolon, and it will disappear. So Command semicolon will turn on and off your guides, because they're kind of in my way right now. All right. Next is changing the color, but not just outright like changing pinks to yellow. This is called changing the color temperature. Right now we're in a room lit by fluorescent lights, right? Those are warm fluorescents, they're yellowish. So added to our skin tones, to our clothes, to our desks, to the floor, is this kind of yellowish temperature. Whereas if we went outside, which is a full spectrum light, that yellow wouldn't be in our skin tones. So color temperature is really important. We change that with color balance, which we have not used before. So first you do levels for lights and darks, then you do color balance to set the temperature of the color. And it's really fun to play with in sky or background elements because you can decide whether the background is warm or cool. Just like with your levels, you have three options. You can mess with the highlights, the shadows, and the midtones. But instead of them being little triangles that are sliders, they're just these categories. Always start with the midtones. The midtones are always the safest place to play with. So start with the midtones, and now I'm going to say with the yellow to blue slider, do I want it to go a cooler temperature, or do I want it to go a warmer temperature? And already, certain options are going to feel better. And again, you don't want to push it all the way to the edge. At most, you want to go maybe like 50% in either direction. So I'm going to go a little bit more towards the warm. And then, do I want it to go towards magentas, like the pinks, or a little bit more towards greens, just in the color temperature? And I want it to go a little bit more towards green. Do I want it to go more towards red, or more towards cyan? Oh, like red looks a whole lot better. Or maybe not even move it that much at all, but a little bit more towards red. Now, if I want to play with it and get a little bit more extreme, I can do highlights. And I recommend you always warm the highlights. A little bit towards yellow, a little bit towards red. And then shadows, and that you always do the opposite with the shadows. This increases the color dimension of the image, especially photographs. So it adds warmth to your highlights, cools to your shadow. It's just good color theory. It helps separate them out. So you can play with that, right? And it gives me this very, very believable looking kind of pink clouds on a bright blue sky. And again, I can, once I hit return or say okay, I can go back in my history and say, okay, that's what it looked like before with just levels. That's what it looked like before I even did levels. And you can see how much it changes those pixels, just the color and the lighting. The last one you want to use is not always needed, but this is for big swings in color. And it's called hue saturation. So what are the three direct adjustments you need to know for the whole semester? Levels, color balance, and hue saturation. And I'll put that in the name of this video, right? And they're under image adjustments. So hue saturation is about the intensity and the spectrum of the color. So if this is a blue sky, but I want it to be in a planet where there's yellow skies, I can just change the whole hue, right, to something else. And it will change it relative. And that can be pretty cool. It can be kind of a psychedelic. I haven't done a yellow sky in the class yet. Right? But the further you push it on the spectrum, the more kind of blasted out it's going to get in one color zone. Whereas towards the middle, it's going to have more variety. But it's a good idea to kind of push your hue a little bit in both directions and see what feels better. The next thing is saturation. That's the intensity of the color. High saturation means really intense. Low saturation means grayscale, right? So how intense do I want this colorful sky? Maybe about right there. Do not play with the lightness slider. Why? Because we've already controlled that with levels. And we controlled that in a better way with levels. If you want it to be lighter or darker, then go back to levels after you've done this. So, those are the three: levels, color balance, hue saturation. Let's look at what they did. First I did levels, and I chose to lighten the midtones. Then I did color balance, and I chose to warm it up. And then I did hue saturation to take down its intensity a little bit and push its spectrum a little bit more towards the warm. I can apply those same things to each layer. So even though this mountain range doesn't look like it matches at all with that sky, and definitely doesn't match with what comes in front of it, this is how I can get it to match. I start with image adjustment levels, and I decide with the mid-tone slider, do I want them to go darker or lighter? I definitely don't want them to go lighter. I want it to go a little bit darker. The other nice tool in levels is what's called the limits. The limits is this. If I don't want any bright whites in it at all, I can limit it like that. And if I don't want any dark shadows in it at all, I can limit the shadows to a certain percentage of gray, which actually might make sense for this background because I don't want really dark shadows in it, even though I want it to get darker. So I'll just limit it a slight bit. You can see that histogram. It's all in the middle. It's away from the edges. The problem is the color is all wrong, right? Now its value works a little bit better, but its color is wrong. So what do I do next? Well, first I can see, did I like that change? Yeah, that levels change made a big difference. Now I go to image adjustments, and what's next after levels? For the temperature of the color. Think of a scale. Do you want it more warm or more cool? You guys know. What's after levels? Color balance. There we go. The group intelligence. You guys will get more and more confident. All right. So with color balance, that's where this is going to make a real change. You see how yellow and warm that back mountain range is? I'm going to push the midtones of that towards the blues. And you see how it's going purple instead of blue? That's because I want to move it towards the cyans and away from the reds. And a little bit to the greens. And now when I go to the highlights, I can warm them up, but there's already so much warmth in there, I'm actually going to cool them down. And the cyan isn't needed so much. Maybe a little bit of that pink is needed. And then maybe temper it a little bit. And then the shadows, I'm actually going to warm up the shadows because they're a little strong. I'm looking over here. A little bit towards the reds. Yeah. All right. Now I hit OK and I can see. This takes a lot of kind of playing with to get used to, but it was like that. Now it's like this. And before levels, it looked like that. So you can see how dramatic that difference is. What's the last tool? So we're learning 3 of these. Levels, color balance. What's next? Hue saturation. It's right on top of color balance. These are the 2 kind of color ones. Hue saturation is for big swings of the spectrum of the color, so I can just change it completely, right? But I want to keep it near the middle, but I want to see which one feels better, and it feels good to push it over to about there. And then how saturated, how intense. Maybe about there. Just to goose the color a tiny bit. Okay, again, from here, levels, color balance, hue saturation. And I get to my background mountains. Now I go to the ones on top of that. And this is really good to do before you do any fine cutting out. Because if you can make the values and the colors work better together, then you have so much more leeway in how you blend and how you delete, right? Because most of the colors will match. We are not learning with this project how to change light direction, but we will be learning that in our next assignment. Because on landscapes, it's really hard to change overall light direction. So we're talking about big spaces. All right, now this mountain range, which looks very purple and very sharp, right? The one that's behind the bridge. Same thing, image, adjustment. You guys can start applying this to your other layers, or you can just remind yourself that you're going to review this video when it comes time, right before you do clean cutouts, to match the colors and the tones. And I use the mid-tone slider to decide if I want it to go darker or lighter. I want it to go a little bit lighter. I'm going to limit some of those highlights, though, and maybe limit some of the shadows. That's called atmospheric perspective because there's a lot of air and water molecules in the air between the foreground and the background. Now I can go to the color, and I already know the color needs to go warmer and go a little pinker, more towards magenta. So I go to color balance, and I'm going to push it a little bit away from the blue, in the midtones. I always start with the midtones and then push it more towards the magenta.